Good morning. Today we're going to talk about the Constitution of the United States. Now, before we get started, one of the things that we need to make sure that we understand, it's so easy in our present day to vilify politicians, to vilify the entire political process. The media helps us do that, and we do it pretty well on our own as well. And when we look back, it's like they're made of marble, and that's just not a true statement at all. The Founding Fathers, sorry women, it was Founding Fathers, had just as many problems and insecurities and issues as any politician today. Any politician today. They were insecure. They lacked moral values, if you will. One of them murdered the other one. I mean, the vice president under Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, went out with the first Secretary of the Treasury, and they had a duel, and Alexander Hamilton was killed. That hasn't happened yet in the present day too much. But what I want to say is, when you look back at politics, it is just as ugly and wonderful as it can be today. People ask me, as a historian, people ask me, so today do you think this is the worst American politics has ever been? No, I absolutely do not. Now, there are times that we're disappointed with our politicians. There are times that we're disappointed with our friends, or our enemies, or ourselves. But the political process has not changed that very much. The media was just as terrible, livid, vivid, back in the 1780s as it is today. So, let's talk about the Constitution. Now, when we talk about the American Revolution, there are two documents that sort of rise to the surface. Two documents that, if there are sacred documents in American history, these are two of them. The Declaration of Independence, of course, and the Constitution. Now, those two things did completely opposite things. The Declaration of Independence did exactly what it says. It declared independence from Great Britain. The 13 North American colonies were part of the Commonwealth. They were part of Great Britain, and they declared independence. And it was a radical idea. The first part of it, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. All men are created equal. Now, they didn't quite believe that, but the good words. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new governments. And of course, that's exactly what they did with the Constitution. Now, the story of the Constitution is like the story of every good piece of sausage. It's a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and it's crammed together with a lot of compromise. Americans today don't like compromise. We don't like it at all. But our entire form of government, and especially the Constitution of the United States, is based on compromise. And the one time in American history when we failed to compromise led to the bloodiest war we've ever been in. And of course, that was the Civil War. More American soldiers died in the Civil War than all other wars Americans have been in put together. And that's because we failed to compromise. Before we talk about the Constitution itself, people don't realize that the Constitution we have today is the second, actually, Constitution that we've had in our country's history. Most people know that the Second Continental Congress that met in the summer of 1776 wrote and developed the Declaration of Independence, that amazing document that basically says we will be free from the British government. What also happened, though, at the Second Continental Congress is that Congress also put together a different committee, not as famous as the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence, but a second committee to draft what would be a constitution for how we are going to run this country. You know, it's really interesting when you have a revolution. The easy part is breaking free. The harder part is in creating something out of it. And what these Founding Fathers were attempting to create was something that the world had never seen before. It really was a government created for the people and by the people. That had not happened before. We were not going to have a king. We were not going to have the military in charge. We were going to have civilians in charge. Well, some of the civilians. We'll get back to that later. So the second committee out of the Second Continental Congress in 1776 writes what we now call the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation are, in essence, the first Constitution of the United States. And they are ratified in 1777, and they become the Constitution of the United States. Now, the government that they establish is radically different than the government we have today. So the Articles of Confederation, basically what they do is, today we have a three-branch government, and we'll talk more about that later. Under the Articles of Confederation, we only have a one-branch government. We only have the legislature, which actually the Second Continental Congress becomes the national government out of necessity, because the war was going on with Great Britain. They had to get funds, they had to regulate trade, they had to establish diplomatic relations with other European countries. So the Second Continental Congress, in essence, becomes the federal government. Now, under the Articles of Confederation government, it was a very, very weak centralized government, which makes perfect sense. What were we trying to rebel against? In our opinion, a strong, despotic government led by a king. So it's sort of like when you're rebelling against your parents when you're in your teens. What do? You probably go about as far away from your parents as you possibly can. Our parent was Great Britain. We went about as far away from a strong, centralized, despotic government as we possibly could. Now, one of the things in American history that's sort of unique for our country is this tension that we continually have, and we still have today, look at the news, between the power of the federal government and the power of the state government. Most countries don't have that. There are no states in Great Britain. There are counties, and there's the federal government. There's no states. And as we've seen even recently with COVID and with other things that are going on, there is a continual tension between the federal government and its power and the state government and its power. Under the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States, the states had all the power. The states had all the power. The federal government could not directly tax its people. It could issue money, but it couldn't tax. So what do you have? You have instant inflation. There was no separate executive branch, the President of the United States. There was no separate federal judiciary system. If two states get into a legal squabble, they had to go to some kind of arbitration. There was no Supreme Court. There were no federal courts whatsoever. There was the Congress of the United States. For many people, during the Revolution and immediately after the Revolution, that was fine. Once again, what are you trying to do? You're revolting against this very strong, despotic, centralized government that we had in Great Britain. You want to get as far away from that as you possibly can. However, money was an issue. As I said, the federal government could issue money, it could not tax money. It actually had to ask the states and private citizens to fund it. How do you think that would go over today? Not very well at all, would it? It didn't go over very well then either. The federal government got so poor that it actually couldn't pay its bar tab in Philadelphia and had to leave in the middle of the night. Now, that does not really instill a lot of faith in your federal government, does it? In fact, it became kind of a waif child moving from New York to Annapolis to Virginia, other places, getting away from its debtors. People around the world, also other countries, did not respect this government as well. Poor John Adams, he's the first, imagine how hard this would be. He was the first ambassador from the United States under the Articles of Confederation. He was the first ambassador back to the court of Great Britain, the country that we, in many ways, were still at war with. When he goes in front of King George III, George III asks him, well, Mr. Adams, do you represent one government today or 13? The countries around the world had no respect whatsoever for the federal government of the United States. As we continue from 1777 toward the late 1780s, the situation in the United States is growing worse and worse. You're having problems with Native Americans on the frontier because they're not respected by the government. You're having problems with veterans from the American Revolution because the federal government is so poor it cannot pay its veterans their wages. You have problems with merchants because the federal government cannot regulate trade. It's all up to the state. So in other words, if you're a merchant in New York and you're selling merchandise to very, very nearby New Jersey or Connecticut, you actually had to work through those state governments. All the taxes were on the state level. You'd have to pay taxes, different tax rates at each of those states. In the 1780s, more and more people were beginning to realize, at least the political elite, were beginning to realize that the Articles of Confederation were going to have to be changed. The two major things that they realized would have to happen is that the federal government would have to be able to draft troops and would also have to be able to tax directly. Many people across the United States, that was the one thing that they could, or the two things actually, that they could agree upon, is that the federal government needed to be stronger than it was. Okay? So, the Congress of the United States in the summer of 1787 asked representatives from each of the states to get together, now listen to this, to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. That was their job. The job was to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. As I said, most people believed that that would probably entail draft troops and tax the people directly. Okay? They got together in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. It was a very hot, humid, muggy summer. 55 men got together, supposedly, to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. Of course, what they did was not that at all. In essence, the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was almost a second revolution on its own. Now, a while ago I talked about how these politicians were not perfect. We kind of deify them these days, that they were gods. They were not at all. It's really interesting, one of the very first things that they did, that those 55 men did, was that they voted that all deliberations would be secret. That the press and anybody on the outside of those 55 men would not know a single thing that was going on. We probably wouldn't put up with that today, would we? But that was one of the very first things that they did, is all the deliberations would be completely private. In fact, one of the only reasons that we know very much at all about the Constitutional Convention is because James Madison was a heck of a diary keeper. And we can go back and look at his diary. It really is the only record. There are no official records whatsoever of the convention that gave us our Constitution. One of the divides, I said earlier about the politicians being divisive, of being at odds with each other. One of the very, very big divides that was happening across America was the divide between the larger population states, Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, and the smaller states, the states with much smaller population, Delaware, New Jersey, Massachusetts, places like that. The larger states had wanted to have a much louder voice in the federal government. Under the Articles of Confederation, every state got one vote on every matter. So if you're Virginia and you're the most populous state, you don't get any more weight, if you will, than Delaware or New Jersey or Rhode Island. So the larger states were not very happy about that at all. And in fact, James Madison, who represented Virginia, before he even got to Philadelphia in 1787, had already drawn up a proposal to basically obliterate the federal government of the United States and start all over again. To be honest, what he was doing was treason. That was not what they were supposed to do. That was not the authority that was given to them by Congress. Once again, the authority was to strengthen the existing government. According to the Virginia plan, the House of Representatives would be based on population. The House of Representatives would then elect the Senate, with no guarantee that each state would have representation. In other words, Virginia would have a bunch of representatives, Delaware 1 or 2. If they voted on the Senate, Delaware probably wouldn't have a senator at all. Well, you can imagine, the small states were not happy about this whatsoever. So the small states, representatives from the small states, got together and developed what we now call the Small State Plan, or the New Jersey Plan. And in this plan, the very first thing that they said was, hey, wait a minute. This is treason. This is not why we were here. We are here to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. That is the only authority we have. So the New Jersey Plan offered that the Articles of Confederation would stay, but that the federal government would be allowed to do those things we talked about earlier, draft troops and levy taxes. Now, once again, it's the New Jersey plan that really fulfilled the authority given to these delegates. However, once the Virginia plan was sort of floated around, people saw the beauty of it. People saw the need for a separate executive branch. People saw the need for a separate judiciary branch. So according to the Virginia plan, once again, the large states would have the advantage. According to the New Jersey plan, the smaller states would keep equilibrium with the larger state. So we have a compromise. Now, once again, as I said at the very beginning of this speech, Americans don't like to compromise, and we don't like our politicians because they do compromise, do we? We don't. We don't like them when they have to give something up that we hold dear if they're our representative. But you have to compromise. The entire system of government is based on compromise. And so we had a compromise. Before we get to that compromise, though, let me talk about a different compromise that also was really having a hard go of it between the states. Now, most of you know that at this time, slavery was legal in many of the states of the United States. And one of the things that the slaveholding states, primarily in the South, were very afraid of, was that the federal government would be so strong that it would outlaw slavery. The Southern states believed that slaves were defined as property, and that property was protected by, it would be protected by the Constitution, it would even be protected by the laws of Great Britain. So the Southern states believed that their slaves were their property and their property was protected. Many people in the North, the abolitionists, believed that the slaves were people and that slavery was wrong, was morally wrong. The abolitionist movement of the mid-19th century sort of shoved slavery from an economic and political question to a moral question. And we know how difficult it is to compromise on moral issues. So, what were we going to do about slavery? Well, you ask, why did that matter in the Constitution? Well, because if slaves were counted as people, then that would be counted in population, which would affect not only the House of Representatives, but the Electoral College. And the Electoral College, of course, would be the institution, still is the institution, that elects the President and the Vice President of the United States. Now, I can say this because I'm a Southerner. Southerners wanted it both ways. Southerners wanted their slaves to be defined as property so that they would be protected, but they also wanted them to be defined as people. You had states like South Carolina that actually had more slaves, a larger black population, slave population, than they had a white population. So that population would more than double the amount of representatives that they would have in the House of Representatives and their representation in the Electoral College. Northern states said absolutely not. You cannot have it both ways. Either they're slaves in property or they're slaves in people. You cannot have it both ways. Now, what comes out of this is really a terrible compromise. It's called the Three-Fifths Compromise. And there is no medical, scientific, literary basis for it whatsoever. It was pure political compromise. A slave would count as 3/5 of a white person as far as being in the House of Representatives, electorals for the House of Representatives or the Electoral College. Once again, there's no basis to this whatsoever. It was political leg wrestling, and they compromised. Now, back to the original compromise that we talk about, what are we going to do about the Congress with the House of Representatives and the Senate? Now, most of the small states were pretty happy with the idea of an executive branch and a judicial branch. Of course, they were not happy at all that they would be underrepresented, as far as they were concerned, in the House of Representatives, and maybe not represented at all in the Senate. So then that compromise we call the Great Compromise. And it's still very similar to what we have today. Not exactly what we have today, but very similar. The House of Representatives would be based on population. The Senate, there would be 2 senators from every state. So you have the large states pretty much getting what they want with the House of Representatives, and the smaller states getting what they want in the Senate. And that's how it is today, of course, that no matter how small a population, Wyoming, Montana, we usually have one representative and 2 senators, exactly as it is today. So we have the Great Compromise. So the summer's over. They've got their document. They have leg wrestled and made sausage all summer long. What's the problem? Do you remember why they were sent to Philadelphia? They were sent to Philadelphia to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. What have they done? They've overthrown the government. So they have to go back, and also remember, all of their deliberations have been completely silent to the outside world. The outside world had no idea what was going on. People were not allowed to write their spouses. People were not allowed to discuss this with the press at all. So when all these delegates go home, their state legislators are horrified. What have you done? You have not done at all what we told you to do. Now, what's interesting when you study history is we know the end of the story, so we go, yeah, it wasn't a big deal. Ratification of the U.S. Constitution took 2 years. 2 years of fighting state by state by state to get the Constitution that was created in that summer to become the Constitution of the United States. 2 years of political fighting. So y'all, political fighting is nothing new whatsoever. And I want to tell you something, editorials in the newspapers were horrible to each other. The Federalists was the group of people who supported the Constitution. They understood that the federal government had to be supreme. They understood that if this country was going to survive, they would have to have a strong federal government. The Anti-Federalist, not a great name, they couldn't come up with anything snappier. The Anti-Federalists were the people against the Constitution. The Constitution had way overstepped its boundaries. The true political power should be in the state. It should remain in the state. That is the true political power. Now remember, folks, when we started even the American Revolution, most people didn't consider themselves Americans. They were Virginians. They were from Pennsylvania. They were from New York. They very rarely used the term American. They saw that they were from their own state. That's how they viewed. They were citizens of Virginia or Massachusetts. So during this 2 years of really terrible political fighting to get this document ratified, one of the issues that developed was the Anti-Federalists sort of understood that they were going to lose this fight, that the federal government would be created, and many of them understood the wisdom of that. But what they were afraid of is once again creating what we had won a Revolutionary War against, a strong federal government that would take away individual rights. So part of the 2-year compromise that happened was that the Anti-Federalists insisted that the Constitution contain individual protections for me against the government. So ratification of the Constitution happens in 1789. Remember that the convention was 1787, ratification in 1789, and then 2 years later in 1791, the Bill of Rights were added. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and they are some of the most important ideals that we hold: freedom of religion, freedom of the press, unreasonable search and seizures, cruel and unusual punishment. And it is one of the most unique constitutions in the world because we've created this federal government, but at the same time, we have limited the federal government to protect our individual rights. So the Constitution is very, very important because not only does it establish the government that we have, but it also establishes these ideas of individual freedoms. So those people who fought the American Revolution still got their voice. Now, one more thing that I want to say. It's interesting also when we look back, as I said earlier, in history, we seem to deify these people. The Constitution is the greatest document ever. There's a couple of things to remember, though. Remember that according to the Constitution, the only people who could vote were white men who owned property. Approximately 25-24% of the American population. Women could not vote. Minorities could not vote. Native Americans could not vote. Okay? Now remember we talked about the Senate? We talked about how there were 2 senators from every state. But the founding fathers were so scared of, they called it the mob. They were so afraid of the mob that almost no one in the federal government was directly elected by the people. And the people at that time was only 25% of actually the whole population. Now think about it even today. How are federal judges, how do they get their job? They're not elected. They're appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. How's the president get his job? It's not popular election. We've had a couple of experiences in the last few years when the popular vote did not win. It was electoral college. So the electoral college is who still elects the president and vice president of the United States. And they do not have to completely reflect the voting of the population. Originally, the Senate, even after the Great Compromise, the Senate was not directly elected by the people. The Senate were elected by your state legislatures. Senators did not have to kiss babies until the early 20th century. So the only people in the federal government that were directly elected by the mob, which at that point was only 24 to 25% of the total population, was the House of Representatives. And they gave them a 2-year term so you can get them out of there if they're really bad. Okay? Now the reason I bring that up is not to throw mud at the Constitution, but once again we look in our history and think everything was perfect and everything was wonderful and these documents are sacred. These documents were working documents from the very beginning. Our political process is a mess. Everyone's is. Every political process is a mess. And that's how it is. And there's division, and there's fighting, and there's compromise. And that is something that is our responsibility. So don't look back at the Constitution 234 years ago and think it was perfect, or think that everybody in it was some kind of godlike character. They were not. They had ideas and goals, and they had to compromise, just like we do today. Now, be proud of your Constitution. It is one of the greatest documents in all of civilization. But remember, it was created by ordinary people who gave themselves to create a better tomorrow. Thank you.